2 winters ago, my boyfriend, Alex, and I rented a cabin in northern Minnesota for a long weekend getaway. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision. We both needed a break from work, and the thought of being surrounded by snow-covered pines, far from emails and phone calls, was irresistible. The cabin was perfect. Small but cozy, with a roaring fireplace and large windows overlooking a frozen lake. The rental agency warned us that the area was remote, with no cell service and difficult roads during heavy snow, but that was exactly what we wanted. Just us, the cabin, and the quiet. The first 2 days were idyllic. We hiked, played board games, and spent hours sipping hot chocolate while watching the snow fall outside. By the 3rd day, the storm rolled in. It started with soft flurries, the kind that made everything look magical. But by mid-afternoon, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. The snow came down heavier, erasing the view of the lake and turning the world outside into a swirling white void. "Looks like we're snowed in," Alex said, poking the fire with a log. He didn't seem worried, but I felt a pang of unease. The storm was supposed to be mild, but this felt different. Relentless. As the evening wore on, the storm grew louder, and the cabin felt smaller. The fire was warm, but the cold seemed to seep through the walls. We decided to turn in early, bundling up under thick blankets as the wind howled outside. Sometime during the night I woke up. At first I didn't know why. The storm was still raging, the wind screaming through the trees, but something else had pulled me from my sleep. A sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm. A steady, rhythmic tapping. I sat up, my heart pounding, and strained to listen. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the front door. "Alex," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Someone's outside." He groaned, half asleep. "It's just the wind." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not." Reluctantly, Alex got up and grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table. I followed him to the living room, my breath hitching with every creak of the floorboards. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. When we reached the door, Alex hesitated. "Stay back," he said, before unlocking the deadbolt and swinging the door open. The cold hit us like a slap, the wind whipping snow into the cabin. But there was no one there. Just the endless white of the storm. Alex stepped outside, shining the flashlight across the porch. That's when we saw them, footprints in the snow, leading up to the door. They were fresh, too large to be human, and stopped abruptly at the edge of the porch as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. "Let's go back inside," Alex said, his voice tense. We locked the door, piled more logs on the fire, and tried to convince ourselves it was nothing. Maybe an animal. Maybe the wind had distorted the tracks. But neither of us believed it. The rest of the night was restless. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made my pulse race. I thought I heard faint whispers outside, but I told myself it was my imagination. By morning the storm had eased, but the footprints were still there, half covered in snow. We decided to stay close to the cabin that day, uneasy about wandering too far. The storm could pick up again at any moment, and the thought of getting lost in the snow was terrifying. But as the hours passed, the feeling of unease grew stronger. It started with small things, a shadow flickering past the window, a sudden draft that made the fire flicker, Max, our retriever, growling at empty corners of the room. By late afternoon, we couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was out there. As the sun set, the storm returned with a vengeance. The wind was deafening, shaking the cabin to its foundation. The windows frosted over, and the fire struggled to stay lit. Then the knocking started again. It was louder this time, more insistent. Not just at the door but at the windows, the walls, even the roof. It sounded like dozens of hands pounding in unison. "Who's there?" Alex shouted, grabbing the fireplace poker. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the noise. Then we heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, coming from just outside the window. "Let me in." The words sent a chill down my spine. They didn't sound human. The tone was off, too deep, too hollow. Alex shone the flashlight toward the window, but the frost was too thick to see anything. "Go away!" he shouted, his voice shaking. The voice came again, closer this time. "Let me in." We huddled by the fire, too scared to move, as the knocking resumed. It wasn't just at the windows anymore. It was coming from beneath the floorboards, from the ceiling, from everywhere. Suddenly, the door flew open. Snow blasted into the cabin, extinguishing the fire. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room. And in the doorway, silhouetted against the storm, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers, and its mouth stretched into an impossible grin. "Let me in," it said again, its voice echoing like a chorus. Alex lunged forward, slamming the door shut and bolting it. We backed into the corner, clutching each other as the cabin shook. The knocking turned into pounding, the voice growing louder, more demanding. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. The storm had passed, and the first light of dawn was creeping through the frost-covered windows. We didn't move until the sun was fully up. When we finally stepped outside, the snow was untouched. No footprints, no signs of the storm, nothing. It was as if the night before had never happened. But when we looked closer, we saw it, etched into the snow near the door. A single word, written in jagged, claw-like strokes. "Welcome." We left that morning and never went back. Last January, my brother Ethan and I decided to take a road trip to the mountains. We'd both been through a rough year, work stress, breakups, the usual, and thought some time away from everything would do us good. We rented a car, packed enough supplies for a week, and drove north, hoping to find some peace in the snow-covered wilderness. The plan was simple: drive as far as we could before the sun set, find a cheap motel for the night, and continue the next day. But somewhere along the way, a freak snowstorm rolled in. The road vanished beneath a thick layer of ice and snow, and the car's headlights barely pierced the swirling white. "We need to stop," I said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I can't see a thing." Ethan squinted through the windshield, then pointed. "Look! There's something up ahead." In the distance, through the haze of snow, we saw a faint light. As we got closer, it turned into the outline of a building, a lodge, its windows glowing warmly against the storm. We pulled into the lot, relieved to be off the road. The lodge was old, its wooden facade weathered and covered in frost. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Summit View Inn. Looks abandoned," Ethan muttered as we stepped out of the car. "It's got power," I said, nodding toward the lit windows. "Let's just see if anyone's here." The door creaked as we pushed it open, and a gust of warm air greeted us. Inside, the lodge was surprisingly cozy. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the walls were lined with faded photographs of skiers and mountaineers. A woman in her 60s stood behind the reception desk, smiling warmly. "Welcome," she said. "You boys must be freezing. Looking for a room?" We exchanged a glance, then nodded. The storm outside was worsening, and we didn't have many options. The woman introduced herself as Helen and handed us a key to a room on the second floor. As we climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. The lodge was warm and inviting, but something about it felt off. Maybe it was the silence, no other guests, no signs of staff. Or maybe it was the way Helen had looked at us, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Our room was simple but comfortable. 2 twin beds, a small desk, and a window that overlooked the snow-covered forest. Ethan collapsed onto one of the beds, sighing. "This place is creepy, but at least it's warm." "Yeah," I said, peering out the window. The snow was coming down harder, the trees barely visible through the whiteout. "Let's hope the storm clears by morning." That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, a soft creaking, like footsteps on old wood. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The sound grew louder, coming from the hallway. "Ethan," I whispered, shaking him awake. "What?" he mumbled, groggy. Someone's out there. We both listened as the footsteps stopped just outside our door. For a moment there was silence. Then came the knock, soft, deliberate, and chilling in its precision. "Who is it?" Ethan called, his voice shaky. No response. Just another knock, louder this time. Ethan grabbed the lamp from the bedside table, and I moved to the door, peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty. "There's no one there," I whispered. But the knocking continued. We didn't sleep much after that. The knocking stopped eventually, but the unease lingered. In the morning, we decided to ask Helen about it. "Footsteps?" she said, her expression blank. "Knocking? Oh, I'm sure it was just the wind. This old place creaks all the time." Her answer didn't sit right with me, but Ethan shrugged it off. "Let's just get through the day," he said. "The storm can't last forever." The storm did last. By midday, the snow was piled so high against the windows that we couldn't see outside. The lodge felt smaller, the air heavier. Helen stayed behind the desk, flipping through an old ledger, her demeanor calm but distant. That afternoon, we explored the lodge, hoping to pass the time. Most of the doors were locked, but we found an open one at the end of the first-floor hallway. Inside was a storage room filled with old furniture, dusty skis, and more of those faded photographs. Ethan picked up one of the pictures, his brow furrowing. "This can't be right," he said, showing it to me. It was a black and white photo of the lodge's lobby, taken decades ago. In the background, near the hearth, was Helen. She looked exactly the same. "That's weird," I said, my stomach twisting. "Maybe it's her mother or something." "Yeah, maybe," Ethan said, but he didn't sound convinced. That night, the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, echoing through the halls. We barricaded the door with a chair and sat up in bed, the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The footsteps circled our room, slow and deliberate, stopping occasionally as if whoever, or whatever, was listening. Then the whispering started. It was faint at first, just a low murmur, but it grew louder, filling the room. The words were unintelligible, a mix of guttural sounds and sharp whispers that made my skin crawl. Ethan grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Now." We threw on our coats and grabbed our bags, adrenaline overriding our fear. As we stepped into the hallway, the whispers stopped. The lodge was deathly silent. But when we reached the lobby, Helen was gone. The front door was locked. We searched for another way out, but every window, every door was sealed tight. The storm outside was raging, the wind howling like a living thing. "We're trapped," I said, panic rising in my chest. Ethan grabbed my shoulder, pointing toward the staircase. "Look!" At the top of the stairs stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadow. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural. It tilted its head, as if studying us, and then it moved. The figure descended the stairs, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the lodge. We ran. We didn't stop until we reached the basement, slamming the door shut behind us. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a single bulb. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old ledgers and photographs. Ethan picked up a ledger, flipping through its yellowed pages. His face went pale. "What is it?" I asked. He showed me the page. It was a guest book, filled with names and dates. The last entry was ours. The door creaked open. The figure stood in the doorway, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. The whispers grew deafening, filling my head until I thought I would scream. And then everything went dark. I woke up in the car, the storm gone and the road clear. Ethan was in the driver's seat, staring blankly ahead. Neither of us spoke as we drove away. When we reached the nearest town, I turned back to look for the lodge. It wasn't there. 2 years ago, I took a winter trip to visit my grandfather in his remote cabin deep in the northern Rockies. I hadn't seen him in years, and with life getting busier, I wanted to reconnect. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and was miles from the nearest town, but that was part of its charm. The idea of unplugging for a week sounded like a much-needed escape. I arrived on a bright December morning. The drive up was uneventful, the winding mountain roads lined with snow-covered pines. When I pulled into the clearing where the cabin sat, Grandpa was already outside, bundled in his old coat and waving. His dog, Max, barked excitedly, his tail wagging in the crisp air. "It's good to see you, kiddo," Grandpa said, pulling me into a bear hug. He looked older than I remembered, his once broad shoulders now hunched, but his eyes were still sharp, glinting with the same spark I'd always admired. The first 2 days were perfect. We spent the mornings chopping wood and the afternoons playing cards by the fire. At night, the wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, it was warm and safe. Max would curl up by the hearth, his ears twitching in his sleep. But on the third day, the snow started. It began as a light flurry, just enough to dust the trees and make the world outside look magical. By afternoon, it had turned into a full-blown snowstorm. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and piling snow against the door. Grandpa didn't seem concerned. Storms like this were common in the mountains, he said. We had enough supplies to last weeks, and the woodpile was well stocked. But as the storm raged on, something started to feel wrong. That night, I woke to the sound of Max growling. He was standing by the door, his hackles raised, staring at something outside. The wind was still howling, but beneath it, I thought I heard something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping. "Max, it's just the wind," I whispered, trying to calm him. But he didn't move. His growl grew deeper, more menacing. I got up and peeked through the window, expecting to see nothing but darkness and snow. At first, that's all there was, white flakes swirling against the black night. But then I saw it. A figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible through the snow. It was tall and thin, wrapped in what looked like tattered clothing. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. I stepped back, my heart pounding. "Grandpa," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "There's someone outside." He woke quickly, his years of living alone in the wilderness making him alert. "What are you talking about?" he asked, sitting up. "There's someone out there," I repeated, pointing to the window. By the time he looked, the figure was gone. Grandpa chalked it up to my imagination, the storm playing tricks on me. But Max wouldn't settle down. He kept pacing by the door, growling softly, his eyes never leaving the window. The next morning, the storm had eased, but the snow was deep, almost up to my knees. While Grandpa made breakfast, I went outside to check around the cabin. The snow was pristine, untouched, except for a single set of footprints leading from the woods to the edge of the clearing. They stopped abruptly, as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. I didn't tell Grandpa. I didn't want him to worry, or worse, think I was losing it. That night, the storm returned, fiercer than before. The wind howled like a banshee, shaking the cabin and making the walls creak. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. Around midnight the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the wind, it was coming from the back door. Max went wild, barking and growling, his claws scrabbling against the floor as he tried to get to the source of the noise. "Stay here," Grandpa said, grabbing his shotgun. He moved to the door, his movements slow but steady, and threw it open. There was nothing there. Just the storm. But when he stepped outside, I saw his face change. He bent down, brushing snow away from something on the porch. When he came back inside, he was holding a small wooden figurine, a crude carving of a human figure. It was old, weathered, and covered in strange symbols. "Where did this come from?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know," Grandpa said, his brow furrowed. "But it's not staying here." He threw it into the fire, and for a moment, the flames flared bright blue. The cabin filled with a strange, acrid smell, like burning hair. The next few days were tense. The storm showed no sign of letting up, and the feeling of unease grew stronger. At night, I heard whispers, faint and unintelligible, carried on the wind. Max refused to leave my side, his usual playful demeanor replaced by constant vigilance. Then, on the fourth night, it happened. I woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. The fire had gone out, leaving the cabin in darkness. Max was gone. "Grandpa?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and shone it toward the door. It was wide open, snow blowing in and covering the floor. Beyond it, the clearing was bathed in an eerie blue light, brighter than the moon. I stepped outside, my breath freezing in the air. The light was coming from the woods, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. And in the middle of the clearing stood Max, his head tilted, staring into the trees. "Max!" I called, but he didn't move. I moved closer, my boots crunching in the snow. The light grew brighter, and I saw them, figures emerging from the trees. They were tall and thin, their faces pale and featureless. They moved silently, their tattered clothing whipping in the wind. I grabbed Max by the collar and pulled him back toward the cabin. The figures didn't follow, but they stood at the edge of the clearing, watching. The blue light dimmed, and as it faded, they melted back into the trees. The next morning, the storm finally broke. Grandpa didn't say much as we packed up the truck, but I could tell he was shaken. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The clearing was empty, but I could still feel their eyes on me.